Hello from the Student Academic Success Team here at Ambrose University. My name is Beth, and I'm excited to be with you here today to talk about scientific communication. If you're joining us live today, please take a moment to sign into YouTube and introduce yourself in the live chat. I'd love to know your name. And since we're probably a group of science nerds, I'd encourage you to share some aspect of science that inspires you. It can be a scientific field like mycology, the study of mushrooms. It can be an activity related to science that you enjoy like fishing or hiking, or it can be a particular scientist like Carl Linnaeus, who is famous for his scientific taxonomy. Basically, what inspires you to want to learn more about biology? While you're thinking, I want to jump into our topic, communication in the sciences, particularly the biological sciences. Now, I have a feeling that when you signed up to study biology, communication probably wasn't the first thing on your mind. You were probably thinking about the concepts that scientists study, like genetics or ecology, or maybe a particular career, like physiotherapy, or conservation, or veterinary care. That's pretty natural. In the sciences, we're interested in understanding the human body, our environment, and all of the organisms around us. That's a good and valuable project. But if we think about it a little, we'll discover that we actually can't accomplish that goal without good communication skills. Communication matters partly because it's part of the learning process. To master the content in your area, you need to be able to read and listen well so that you can absorb knowledge from your professors, your textbooks, scholarly articles, and all sorts of other sources. But also, you'll need to use your writing and public speaking skills to demonstrate your learning to others. Now, that's just in the context of your learning environment, of university. But communication also matters because no matter what part of science you end up in, it'll be part of your career. Whether you're working with the general public, with government and industry, or with scholars in your field, you need to be able to communicate clearly and effectively so that you can learn from others and share what you know with others. We need to remember that we are preparing for the future. Right now, your profs have to read what you write. But in the future, you're going to need to communicate with people that don't have to read what you write or listen to what you say. So this time in university is a good time to practice convincing communication. Much of the time, both in school and in your career, you'll communicate your key messages in writing. In university, most scientific writing takes one of three forms: the research essay, the review paper, and the scientific report. Perhaps the one that we're most familiar with is the research essay, perhaps because it's common in high school and other levels of learning. In this kind of assignment, your professor is asking you to look into a particular topic and see what studies in that area have found. Your goal is to assess the evidence that's out there, and then based on that evidence, make a claim about existing knowledge in the field. For example, if your topic is the loss of rainforests in Peru, you might use evidence from a bunch of studies to show that deforestation in that area has increased erosion, flooding, and the loss of biodiversity. Your task here isn't to conduct a study yourself. Your task is to discover, summarize, and use existing evidence to support your claim. The second genre, which is the review paper, is also known as the literature review. It goes a little further. In this kind of writing, your goal is to summarize a whole field of research. Instead of writing just about deforestation in Peru, you might review all of the literature on the effects of deforestation. This type of paper requires you to be a much more sophisticated reader and writer, so you probably won't encounter it until your second or third year. It requires you to condense and digest a whole bunch of information, and so it tends to be an upper year kind of assignment. These first two genres focus on digesting and using existing evidence. The third genre is quite a bit different than the first two. Instead of working with existing evidence, now you're expected to go out and discover things on your own and then report back to the scientific community. So we call this type of writing the scientific report. The scientific report closely follows the process of scientific inquiry. It actually discusses every step that you took along the way, along with your final conclusions. You'll write in this genre all the way through your degree, right from your very first year right until the very end. In the first couple of years, you'll find that your professors give you a lot of guidance and structure for these kinds of reports. When you're just starting out in the sciences, we don't expect you to make grand new discoveries. In fact, most often at the beginning, you'll learn by replicating the experiments of others. And so we often refer to this basic kind of scientific report as a lab report. But as you get further along, you won't stop writing the scientific report, you'll just write it differently. You'll have opportunities to do your own research, to explore new problems, and make new discoveries. And as you progress from first replicating others' experiments to designing your own, good writing skills will become even more essential. You're now trying to communicate new knowledge. In the first year or two of your degree, you'll probably find that you write a lot of pretty straightforward stuff, research essays and highly structured lab reports. But as you get into the later years of your degree, you will likely find that the writing tasks become more and more challenging as you write review papers that have to synthesize a whole field of knowledge or scientific reports that communicate new findings. So, even though communication skills might not seem that important in the early years of your degree, it's worth your time to invest in your writing and learn to do it well. If you're joining us live, join in the chat and tell us about the assignments that you're doing so far for your science courses. You might be doing some writing assignments, maybe not yet, but towards the end of the term. So tell us about what you're doing. Also, if you'd like to learn more about the 3 major genres of scientific writing, we'd encourage you to check out the workshop we offer on major genres in the biological sciences, and we cover those 3 different kinds of scientific writing. Or you can do some research on your own. To start with, you can check out the resources on scientific writing on the Writing Center's website, under the Resources tab. Now, if you become a research scientist in a professional setting, you'll probably keep writing in these genres throughout your career. If not, though, you'll probably still use the same skills that you've learned to communicate with others. For example, if you're an ecological consultant writing a report for government or industry, you might need to summarize a whole bunch of the research on deforestation or river flow or whatever, so that your audience, a government or an industry partner, can make good decisions on those things. If you're a doctor doing an interview on the radio or planning an information session for your patients, you're going to want to be able to communicate the latest information about, say, effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease. So as you practice these skills in an academic setting, remember that you're also preparing for your career. Now, we do have a couple of people joining us live in the chat today. Welcome to those of you who have joined us live. If you have a second, we'd love to hear about what inspires you about science, whether a person or a field of research. And then also, if you have an opportunity to also share a little bit about the assignments that you might be working on. So I invite you to join in there. Now, across these different genres, you'll find that scientific communication shares a set of norms, things that help scientific communicators to understand each other. Scientific style isn't something that we pick up all at once. It's kind of like learning to navigate a new culture in that we have to learn some basics first before we can really get into the details. So for the remainder of our time together, I want to share a few pointers and tips that can help you as you're learning the basics of scientific style. Some of these may be familiar, but I hope that you'll pick up a couple of new things along the way, and that this becomes a foundation for more as you're studying. The first thing we should talk about is correctness. Good scientific writing is correct. It uses good grammar, it uses good punctuation. In his book, The Scientist's Guide to Writing, Canadian biologist Stephen Hurd explains that errors in this area can hurt you in 2 ways. First of all, they can confuse your readers, making it harder for them to understand your point. Second, they can hinder your credibility, thus making the readers less likely to take you seriously. Either way, you want to avoid those kinds of problems. There's a third reason in an academic context in that as students, you want to avoid annoying your professors. But even if that's not a factor, you want to avoid errors in correctness so that you can earn the trust of your audience. Obviously, we need to write in full sentences. We need to spell out words properly, but that's only the foundation. There are far trickier questions, Like, how do I write the name of a gene? Or how do I represent numbers? These things are often discipline specific. They're different in sociology than they are in history, and they're different in history than they are in biology. So one of the areas where scientific writing is different is in how it deals with numbers. As you might have noticed, scientific writing relies a lot on quantitative data, on numbers and figures. But sometimes the rules for using them seem a little murky. So you might wonder, when do we use the numerical symbols for something, or when do we spell it out? Well, let's say that we want to communicate the point that the temperature in our area of study, maybe we're in the Arctic or something, and the temperature has gone up by 2 degrees over time. Which would be better? The symbol 2, like the symbol, or the word 2? In this case, many of us probably prefer the one on the left, the symbol. But what about these other cases? The second and third ones here. 20% of centipedes have the gene DSCAM. Is the 20 better as a symbol or as a word? And then if we look at the last one, we studied a group of 5 one-year-old chimpanzees. Is it better as symbols? The numbers, are they better as symbols or as words? In these cases, it's less clear which option is better. Partly because it's confusing to start a sentence with a symbol or to use symbols when we have 2 numbers back to back. So, in the sciences, typically we use numerals, the symbols, except in a couple of cases. First, if the number is the very first thing in the sentence, then we spell it out. It's just easier for your audience to read, because otherwise it's hard to figure out where one sentence ends and the next one begins. The other case where you might spell out a number is if you have 2 adjacent numbers and you want to clarify that they're separate, like the 5 one-year-old chimps. In this case, we actually want to write out the first number and then leave the second number in symbols, and that clarifies that they're 2 separate numbers. Now, the rules around numbers and how we represent them in text are profoundly different in other disciplines, so be sure that you check before you use numbers in other disciplines. Don't just assume that because it's this way in scientific writing that it's the same in other disciplines. Now, this brings us to the question of units. I'm not talking here about novel abbreviations, things that are new or unusual. I'm talking about standard units of measurements, like kilograms and hours and meters. So let's imagine that we're talking about a flume, which is an artificial stream that you would use in a lab. And let's say it's running at a certain number of meters per second. We could write out meters per second in full words, or we could use the abbreviation m/s or ms to the -1. Which is better? Well, the decision actually depends on the question we just answered about numbers. Normally, when you use the symbol for the number, you use the abbreviation for the unit. If you're writing out the number as a full word, you write out the unit as a full word too. Scientists have also developed some standard practices for how to present scientific names, and correctness matters here too. There are norms around capitalization, italics, and a lot more. Let's start with organism names, sorry. Let's say that I'm writing a paper about a species of bumblebee called Bombus impatiens. That's the formal scientific name of the organism. It includes the genus Bombus and the species impatiens. Now, perhaps you also need to mention in context that bumblebees are from the family Apidae. So we've got 3 different terms here. To represent the formal scientific name, the genus and the species, you should use italics. That shows that it's the scientific name. The genus, the first part of that, Bombus, should be capitalized, so uppercase B. And then the species, impatiens, should be in lowercase. After the first time you use that full name, Bombus impatiens, capital letter B, italics on the whole thing, then you can abbreviate the genus. And then it would be B impatiens. You should still write out the species name in full, so the impatiens never gets abbreviated. Now, that's the first 2 things. The third part is the name of the family, Apidae in this case. Now, it's important but it's not part of the organism's name. We do need to capitalize the first letter, but we don't put it in italics. And that same principle goes if you're talking about the name of a phylum or a class or other parts of the scientific classification scheme. Now, when we get down, so that's for the Latin or scientific names of organisms. When we get down to the cellular level, the rules are a little more complex, but we can start with a couple of general observations. If you're talking about genes, we typically italicize the name of the gene. For proteins, even though they kind of look similar, we don't italicize the name of the protein. There's also a difference between how we handle human and non-human genes and proteins. If the gene or protein is human, capitalize all of the letters in it. If it's not, generally you should capitalize the first letter and not the rest. For example, there's two parallel genes in humans and mice. In humans, the gene is called SHOX2, all caps. In mice, it's SHOX2, but only the first letter is capitalized. These conventions can be a little finicky, but correctness pays off. Your readers are much more likely to trust you, and they're much more likely to understand what you're saying if you're using the language of the scientific community. The next attribute we want to look at is precision. In other words, not just being correct, but being exact. There's lots we could discuss here, but I want to focus specifically on word choice. So let's look at two versions of this sentence. The preservation of the samples involved the use of ethanol versus to preserve the samples, we immerse them in ethanol. Let's look at a couple others. The extracted cells were kept at room temperature overnight versus the extracted cells were kept at 25 degrees Celsius for 10 hours. In both cases, both versions of the sentence, we're being correct. In neither case is there any information that's wrong. But in each case, the second version is much more detailed and exact. Obviously, the more precise we can be, the better. Unfortunately, that's easier said than done. Often we think we're being precise until somebody asks us a question and we're like, oh, I didn't specify, did I? So how do you know if you're being specific enough? Well, anytime you're describing a process, like in the methods section of a scientific report, be sure that you've answered one way to think about it is answering the reporter's questions. What, how, where, and so on. Have you given enough information in answering those questions that somebody else could actually replicate your work, that they could do what you did without asking you questions? Another thing that you can watch for is vague verbs, like the words involve and exist. They usually mean, I did something like this, but I don't really want to say how. So you watch for those. That might be an indicator that you're not being precise enough. Also, watch for wrong words. In the sciences, there's kind of a set of words that are often common culprits that are often confused. So watch for these ones. I won't highlight them all, but there's a couple. For example, compliment and complement. A compliment is like a flattering statement. I compliment somebody. But a complement is something that accompanies something else. You can think of completion here. It's two things that go together. So they're two complementary creatures or something in an ecosystem. Principle and principle. Principle with LE is a standard or a guideline, like in physics, the principle of least action. Principle, AL, refers to the main or primary agent, like the principal solvent was whatever. Another one to notice is because versus since. Because is about causation. I did this because of that. Since can be about causation, but it can also be about time. I did this since I did this other thing. It's best to keep in mind that since could be confusing, so try to use it only for time and not for causation. It means that there's just going to be less confusion. Or use after instead when you're talking about time. Also, you can watch out for terms that have specific technical definitions in the scientific community. For example, when we say normal in everyday life, we just mean kind of like something that happens a lot. But in the sciences, people assume when you say normal that you're thinking about the normal distribution, which is a very specialized concept in statistics. Likewise, the term significant has a very specific statistical meaning. It doesn't just mean important, the way that we use it in everyday language. Words like typical, words like standard also have specific meanings in the sciences that we should watch out for and make sure we're using accurately. Now, while we're on the topic of scientific terms, let's talk about when we might use them or not use them. Now, in the academic context, we're generally speaking to other scientists, but we may sometimes be speaking to a general audience, not other scientists. If we're speaking to a general audience, we'll want to use scientific terms sparingly and explain them well. If we're speaking to an audience of scientists, we can assume that our readers will understand general scientific terms, and so we should use them. However, we still need to be careful not to make our writing so dense and complicated that no one wants to read what we've written. We do need to be precise, but we also need to think about the best interests of our readers. Where we can, we want to keep our writing pretty straightforward. Now, it's easy to get the idea that so-called fancy words are always better. But let's look at a couple of pairs of words. For example, utilize versus use, cognizant versus aware, commence and begin, finalize and complete, modification and change, requisite, required, systematize versus organize, and terminate versus stop. Think with me for a second. Do these pairs really mean different things? Is terminate different than stop? Is utilize different than use? Not really. In each pair, which one is easier for the reader to understand? The one on the right. So why would we use the one on the left? On occasion, we might have a good reason, but in most cases, we're only using those words to try to sound smart. And that's not a good enough reason. When you can use a simpler word without losing any meaning, do it. So, if a complex word doesn't add any meaning to your sentence, don't use it. Use a simpler version. Another concern in scientific writing can be condensed words, like abbreviations and acronyms. In this area, we've actually seen a big shift in scientific writing over the last few decades. Again, Stephen Hurd points out that scientific writing over the last few decades has gotten increasingly to rely on abbreviations and acronyms as scientific work has gotten more technical. Sometimes condensed words, like abbreviations and acronyms, can be helpful. For one thing, they make a long text shorter. But that's not always useful. Imagine that I give you this sentence. The study used the back method to identify the LGs in the species and noted the implications for the species TES. It's a short sentence, so in that sense, it's not hard to read. But if you don't know the specific abbreviations here, the sentence is meaningless. As Hurd points out, abbreviations and acronyms are only really helpful to your readers if they're well known, if the reader doesn't have to stop every time they read the word to try to remember what it means. So what does that mean for you as a writer? If you're using abbreviations that are well known, go for it. DNA, RNA, those ones are very well known, and your readers probably won't have an issue with those ones. Feel free to use those abbreviations widely. If the thing that you want to abbreviate isn't commonly known, but it's really important to your paper, you can use an abbreviation or an acronym. But make sure that you define it first and then give the abbreviation. Also, keep in mind not to do that too many times in one paper. If you're introducing one novel abbreviation, that's probably fine, or two. But if you've got 10 different new abbreviations for your readers to keep track of, that's a big burden for your readers. So we want to be careful about introducing too many novel abbreviations or acronyms. Finally, good scientific writing is concise. It conveys the meaning clearly in the fewest possible words. Now, there are lots of good reasons to be concise. One is that it helps your reader, but another one is very practical. It takes less space. If you pursue a career as a research scientist, you'll find that space is actually extremely valuable, including financially speaking. Some places that you publish your work might actually charge you or your university for that space, and they'll actually charge you by your word count. So the more words you use, the more expensive it'll be. So it's worthwhile to get good at being concise. When you're trying to be concise, it can actually be hard to find the places where you're wordy. I know I have that trouble too. So here's some of the things you can watch for. Well, first, watch for redundant words like collaborate together. Just use collaborate. It already implies the together part. Also keep an eye out for unnecessary formalities. We tend to kind of reach sometimes for things like for the reason of or in order to, but we can actually use simplified versions of those. Instead of for the reason of, we can just say because, or instead of in order to, we can actually just say to. Also, watch out for multi-word verbs, places where you've used a whole string of words to convey one single action. So for example, instead of saying to facilitate the delivery of, you can just say to deliver. So these are ways that you can make your writing more concise without losing anything in terms of content or clarity. So where does this leave us? First, remember that you'll likely encounter those 3 different genres of scientific writing in your studies. The first 2 types, research essays and review papers, ask you to synthesize existing knowledge in the field. The last type, the scientific report, invites you to make discoveries yourself and then report back on what you found. Now, as I said before, you likely won't encounter all of these types of writing right away, and when you do, your professors will do their best to help you grow more comfortable with them. But it's worthwhile to invest your time in mastering these genres as they will come up over and over. Second, we've discussed some of the basic conventions of scientific style. There's lots more that we could cover here, but if you can do these things, you'll already be off to a good start. You'll find that by following these conventions, you're able to communicate your ideas more clearly, and your audience will be more likely to take your ideas seriously. We often overlook the value of communication skills in the sciences, but they're actually really crucial to our project. After all, our goal isn't just to know stuff. We want to be able to use it, and we want to be able to share it with others. To do that effectively, we need to be good communicators. Now, if you have any questions or comments about what we've discussed today, please take a moment to write them in the live chat, and we'd be happy to respond. You can also learn more about all of the things we've discussed today by checking out one of our upcoming workshops or by booking a meeting with a Writing Center tutor here at Ambrose University. You can also email us at studentsuccess@ambrose.edu. We'd also encourage you to check out some of the great resources in the Ambrose Library on scientific communication. Some of them are physical resources, some of them are digital resources as well. So there are quite a lot of really great resources. Now, I'm not seeing any questions in the live chat at the moment. So if you do have questions, we'd be happy to answer them. You can email us or book an appointment with a writing tutor to talk about your next scientific writing paper. Thank you so much for being here today, and we'll see you next time.